And this led to this and the interaction that many local labor movements were having with worker centers led to a new policy that was adopted by the afl-cio 2 years ago exactly, where the Federation voted to allow local worker centers to affiliate with local labor movements, to give them a seat at the table, to let them start collaborating, figuring out where their interests are in common, how to resolve tensions that definitely do exist, and so on. And there's been a lot of progress that's been made over these past 2 years in areas ranging from joint lobbying around state minimum wage levels, dealing with attorneys general on better enforcement techniques, doing worker rights and immigrant rights training together over raids, over other kinds of immigration-related issues, dealing with the very, very common problem of misclassification of employees as so-called independent contractors, taking them out from all labor protections, and other things where there is an awful lot in common. So one of the byproducts of these new relationships has been the Clean Car Wash campaign, the Community Labor Environment Action Network campaign. And what's so interesting about this is that unlike a typical union organizing campaign where unions start to organize and they realize at some point way too late that they need a little bit of street credibility and they go to a community group and ask for their endorsement and it means virtually nothing. This started as a community labor standards enforcement campaign. And it started because a number of worker centers and community groups in Los Angeles recognized that the 7,000 to 10,000 car wash workers, by the way, a fifth of all car washes in the United States are in California, no surprise, and a large proportion of those are in Los Angeles. There are about 430 independent car wash owners. None of the big chains are there. They would not be able to operate on the sub-minimum wage levels that legally, they would not be able to operate there. So you have 450 or so independent operators in this area employing 7,000 to 10,000 car wash workers. They are virtually all immigrants, very, very high percentage of undocumenteds. They have annual earnings that are roughly $12,500, and their conditions are just abysmal. There is virtually universal noncompliance with minimum wage, wage an hour, overtime, health and safety, other minimum labor standards. They are not only paid less than minimum wage, sometimes they are paid tips alone, or as I said before, there is outright wage theft, non-payment entirely. They are typically denied overtime pay, even when they work more than 8 hours or 40 hours a week. They are subjected to health and safety hazards and exposure to toxic chemicals that are abysmal. And there is standard or very common retaliation anytime any car wash worker complains, much less complains collectively, much less talks about forming a union. So the Los Angeles community groups came to recognize that even if they were successful in getting the media spotlight on this situation, and on getting government enforcement agencies in there for a little while and getting public officials sympathetic, that once that sort of things moved on, that standards would just revert. Once the media lost interest and government agencies moved on to their next industry, standards would just revert. Unless there was an opportunity for an ongoing enforcement mechanism in the workplace in the form of unionization and collective bargaining. A contract that would as is available to CEOs, would make it possible for workers to negotiate compliance with standards and ideally improvement on those standards. So they approached the afl-cio, asked us to find a union that would be willing to partner with them. We have the United Steelworkers, the afl-cio, and about 20 community groups, worker centers, ethnic organizations, other community organizations now working on a campaign that was launched just a couple of months ago and that has as a goal a two-part goal. One is to get standards up to minimum legal standards, which, as pathetic as that sounds, would actually be an enormous improvement on their current situation. And then ultimately to get unionization and collective bargaining from which they can start bargaining improvements. How are we planning to do this? Well, we are calling on all car wash owners to enter into clean agreements. And the clean agreement will certify that the car wash owner is committing to do two things. One, to ultimately respect the wishes of a majority of its workers to unionize without opposing that request. And in the meantime, to comply with minimum standards and to submit to third-party monitoring, to give access to books, records in the workplace to a respected third party. And we have the Worker Rights Consortium, which has agreed to be the third-party monitor in Los Angeles, who will ensure that minimum standards are complied with in the meantime. We're doing this through a combination of community pressure. There will be boycotts. We don't think it should be too hard to convince average citizens that there's not a whole lot of brand loyalty out there, that if they have to go 2 blocks down the street to the next car wash, that really isn't asking too much. We're planning to do a lot of wage and hour litigation. We've filed one very high-profile case against one of the more notorious owners so far, and we have a number of law firms that are willing to do pro bono wage and hour lawsuits. We're preparing Cal OSHA health and safety complaints and put pressure on employers to clean up their act that way. And ultimately, when the employers, those employers that do sign and do agree to enter into the clean agreements, we will publicize them just as much as being good employers as the bad ones that we're asking the community to stay away from and that we're litigating against where necessary. And asking the community, of course, to be supportive of all of that. Ultimately, we will negotiate collective bargaining agreements, but so as not to put good employers at a competitive disadvantage. We will wait until a certain percentage of the workforce is unionized before asking to bargain contracts that bring the standards up above minimum standards. So I think there are a couple of lessons here that should be kept in mind. One is we need to remember that the union advantage does still exist, and we can't afford as a society and an economy to lose that advantage. There is still a 30% union advantage across the board within industries of unionized employers versus non-union employers, and those differences are even greater when you look at African Americans, Latinos, Asians, women, and this applies, by the way, as well to employer-funded health care, employer-funded pensions, employer-funded disability pay, all of the key fringe benefits as well. So it is critical that we do something to facilitate unionization in low-wage industries in particular. It is a very broken system that we have right now. The companies call all the shots and make it virtually any employer, any well-advised employer that wants to keep a union out has a practically guaranteed opportunity to do that. We are hoping that the next administration will see fit to sign into law the Employee Free Choice Act that will make it easier for those workers, and the latest poll shows that there are some 53% of workers say they would vote for a union tomorrow if they had that opportunity, and a way higher percentage than that say they would if they didn't have to worry about employer retaliation. But finally, more to the point, aside from legislative change, we need to be encouraging and supporting these community labor coalitions. Until the culture itself changes, it doesn't matter if the law changes by itself. Employers will always find new ways around the law. There'll be loopholes. And we need to change the culture itself. And in my opinion, that means having communities recognize that the labor movement is theirs, that unions are part of the community. And I say that as much in recognition that this is something organized labor needs to bear in mind as much as the community groups need to figure out how to take advantage of that. This is a wonderful opportunity. I hope that this will serve as a model in low-wage community labor coalition organizing, and I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that happens. Thank you very much.